Okay. As a start, can you please say and spell your name?
Sure. My name is Leigh Raiford, Leigh, Raif as in Frank, O-R-D.
Great. And can you then give us an autobiographical sketch of your own travels through the world of higher education, the kind of institutions you've been at, the positions
Sure.
you've held, and just kind of what your path has been through higher ed?
Sure. I feel like I actually need to go back to high school because I went to a specialized public high school in New York City that was run by the Board of Higher Ed in New York, Hunter College High School. And I mention all that. It was, gifted and talented, you tested in, but it was public. So in some ways there was a little bit of a diversity, at least class-wise, of students. But basically everybody went to college, and everybody had to go to a good college. We were only allowed to apply to 5 schools, and so out of a class of 200, there were 20 people who applied to Brown, and 12 who ended up going. To go to SUNY was seen as a kind of as a defeat, right? So my whole sense coming out of high school, or in high school and coming out of high school, was that there were kind of a limited number of good schools that you went to, and you found the one that fit you, but it had to be in the kind of the top 20 of the U.S. News and World Report. Added to that, my father graduated from Yale College in 1971, so he also, he really wanted me to be the first legacy of his class. I was born in New Haven, and then he went to, we moved to Boston, to Cambridge, and he got an MBA from Harvard. So I had a very I was brought up with very intense ideas about what counts as quality education. I went to Wesleyan in Middletown, Connecticut, which at that point, when I arrived in 1990, had just sort of experienced the bombing of the president's house the spring before the fall that I arrived. So it was a campus that was kind of in the midst of a lot of protests, and which kind of went along with its reputation for being what's the word I'm looking for being an activist school.
And those were protests over what?
There were protests. Well, it's kind of complicated because it turned out that the bombing was not by students, but it opened up. There were a lot of protests around racial discrimination on campus. Like graffiti or racial epithets that were written on the Malcolm X house, the Black student themed house, and just sort of general kind of feelings of a negative campus climate, which I kind of laugh about now because I'm like, we didn't know what a hostile racial climate was in 1990, right? But Wesleyan was small. It was, and at that point, and the time that I was there, it was something like, I would say, a third people of color, and so it felt. It was kind of the apex of multiculturalism in that moment. But I loved my time at Wesleyan. I loved being in a small liberal arts setting. The kind of access to faculty, being able to navigate a small community. I liked the quiet to a certain extent, and. Then I took a year off, and while I was at Wesleyan, I applied to and was selected into the it was called the Mellon Minority Undergraduate Fellowship. Now it's Mellon Mays, which supports underrepresented minorities into careers through the academy, and I wasn't sure that was what I wanted to do, but I liked learning, and I thought this was a good opportunity to work more closely with some of the faculty. So I took a year off between college and high school, and I went to, or high school and college, between college and graduate school, and then I arrived at Yale in the fall of '95. My dad was very happy that I'd finally made it to back to New Haven, and it's interesting because I think coming from the kind of having the sort of pedigree that I had, there were ways that Yale didn't feel very foreign to me. And in part because, I knew a little bit about New Haven. But, for my husband, for Michael, coming from a big public school in Colorado, it was, he really experienced culture shock. But for me, I think I had a sense of, a sense of, I guess, as much as a graduate student can have, right? A certain sense of belonging, of access. I knew that, I think I already knew that the place was, that if I wanted to, wanted to succeed in the academy, that I really I needed to go to one of the top tier schools. I needed to be in an Ivy. And certainly for the work that I was doing, that I knew, at that point there were only maybe 2 or 3 PhD programs in African American Studies, so I was committed to that field. Then, when I did spend a semester at UC Berkeley, and I was just talking to somebody about that today, and I loved it. I had applied it in graduate school, and I loved visiting. But when I spent 9 months in the ethnic studies PhD program, I had a really great experience. But I found the work wasn't quite as challenging. It was let me rephrase that. There was so much going on in the Bay Area, and I was so excited to kind of be out in the world, and keeping in mind that I started graduate school, I turned, I think I turned 22 or 20. Let's see, 95. So I turned 23 my first semester of graduate school. So I hadn't really done a whole lot at all in the world. But I got to Berkeley, and I became part of a spoken word live music performance group. I get really involved in prison abolition work. I was really involved in the underground hip hop scene. Was traveling all over, and so I was really enjoying. And then I was in class, right? But I felt like, what was sort of incredible about Yale and hard about it was that I was in class 6 hours a week, and I felt like I spent the rest of the week preparing to be in class for those 6 hours. And this was a completely different experience. But I realized by the end of that I missed it. I missed the intensity of that intellectual experience and that work. So then when I went on the job market, I just saw myself, I really wanted to be at a small liberal arts school. My dream job, my first year on the job market, was at Smith. I wanted that job so badly I'd get tasted. I wanted to raise my family in Western Massachusetts. This is what I wanted to be, but I was fortunate. I was getting job offers, but they were all these big state schools, right, with graduate programs. I got an offer at UC Santa Barbara, an offer at University of Minnesota, and then the next time I went out on the market, and then I spent 2 years at Duke. So anyway, I kept thinking, like, what do these people want with me? Like, what do they, because I didn't see myself as being able to command a classroom of that size, of being able to navigate a huge campus. The thing about like now being head grad advisor at UC Berkeley, I can't even fathom the amount of bureaucratic savvy that the students have to have just to make sure that they get their funding right on time. Which I feel like maybe I did worry about it. I don't think I worried about anything really at Yale. I was like, oh, it's gonna, my check is coming. My fellowship is here. It's all good. But I ended up taking a postdoc at Duke, and that was, it was a lot like Yale, but even more intense because it was so far away from New York and from the Northeast that I think people really just they kind of dug in. And but my sort of so intellectually it really was one of the most rigorous experiences that I've had.
And you were doing some teaching for that? I
did some teaching. I would say that the thing I did not like about Duke was the undergraduate teaching. I think it felt very pre-professional. Working with graduate students was amazing because they were there to work and they were there to think and they were excited to be there. But the undergraduate teaching was really challenging. It was sort of the first time I felt like I had encountered, I think now what I would recognize or name as, what a lot of people call the kind of, consumer model of education, the sense that students are there purchasing a service, purchasing a degree, and their own participation in the classroom or the amount of work that they might put into a project was kind of irrelevant, because in the end they were there to be pedigreed,
credentialed, right?
Credentialed.
And it's interesting to me. But you did not see that in your years at Yale.
I didn't see that in my years at Yale. I think also, one of the things was that again, because we were funded, and the year after I came in was when GSO had worked to secure full and equal funding for all admitted graduate students, which completely changed the vibe of everything. People were a lot kinder to each other and less stressed out. But we didn't have to teach very much, right? Whereas, at a place like Berkeley, if students either don't win a multi-year fellowship from the graduate division, I can talk more about that, the problems with that system, but or they don't come in with their own funding, we provide them with a package that usually entails some form of teaching. So you get, students who are coming in their first year and they're teaching. So that kind of, and if you're doing that like every semester, you are really encountering a kind of different, I think a lot more students. The kind of students I had, I think certainly in African American studies, the students were, some of them were less engaged than others, but I think there was, I feel like there was just a sense of kind of, mission or purpose being Black at Yale or being a student in taking an African American studies course.
So in those years, African American studies students were almost all Black.
They were almost all Black, yeah.
That's really changed in the Obama years.
Really?
In an interesting way, yes.
That's so interesting because it is...
I think maybe it's now going back towards that, but there was a minute in 08, 09, 2010.
What kind of classes were they taking? Were they taking just the intro
Nobody's
classes?
Majoring, but like if you offered an African American studies surveys, there were suddenly a bunch of white kids who felt like it was something they needed to know.
I would love that. I actually, there are times that I love the field of African American studies. I love the work that we do, but I also, the way at Berkeley, at least the students who take African American studies courses or major, are, they're almost all black, almost all, actually somewhat fairly conservative, don't want to talk about gender and sexuality, are often very religious. They're looking for, a lot of times, sometimes they're looking for something that resembles home. They're looking for any kind of intellectual tradition to be part of. But American Studies actually at Berkeley is the place where the alternative blacks go, right? Mm-hmm. Like all the folks who are, who don't necessarily who see themselves kind of maybe more on the margins, right? Or have a kind of more tenuous relationship to blackness. That's where they end up often as American Studies majors. But yeah, I felt like, but at Yale, that was definitely, Tawakli Wasona was one of my first students. She was brilliant and a great writer, and there were all these just amazing students doing really amazing things. But yeah, I didn't actually teach very much. I did teach in American Studies. There was some of that. I think it may also have been that I was just less focused on teaching, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas now, and I think this has certainly been shaped by my experience at Berkeley and in a public institution, that teaching is probably the most important, the most political part of my job. It's sometimes the most radical part of my job. But I also have no doubt it's the most important part of my job.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I want to talk about your years at Berkeley, but first let me just make sure we've filled this out. So you did the postdoc at Duke. Was there anything between there and your job at Berkeley?
No.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So before we get to the Berkeley years, I want to just go back and pick up something you said. You were talking about your own sense of, and this came from your own school experience and particularly your family experience, but you felt a kind of permission to be on a liberal arts campus or to be at a place like Yale, and it felt like more like organic to you than it does to many, many people.
Yeah,
and I was just wondering, from your perspective, are there things that institutions themselves or that educators can do to impart that sense of permission, and what are those things?
I think the first part is starting, in high school and in middle school and in high school. I think, I see it with Maya, with my daughter, who's, going to be 15 next week, and just her sense of actually knowing what college looks like, what's expected of you, what it takes to actually get there, right? The logistical stuff like AP credits and grades and that sort of thing, but also just, what does a college classroom look like? How does it differ from a high school classroom? I think that makes a difference, because then people can kind of, they can see themselves, project themselves. But I think, on one level, one of the challenges I think at Berkeley is in part it's about numbers in many ways, right? That there's so few students of color that, I think so many people internalize the message, the idea that that they are somehow so exceptional, right? They're either so exceptional that they have somehow done something very, very differently from everybody else, as opposed to it's actually the kind of constraints of the institution itself, or that they just don't belong. And I think talking to Black alumni who are my age, who went to Berkeley, in the late 80s, early 90s, because there were so many more Black students, that the sense that they actually belonged on campus and that there was ownership, and that they also didn't all have to like each other, right? They could all be different. There wasn't this kind of party platform or this kind of required kinship. that was, that they had to perform, I think, made a difference. I think also on a campus, I think one of the challenges, or something else I think could be done or might help, is that it's such a big place, and the departments are really siloed, and so there's not, it's most classes aren't there's no cross listing of classes. There are very few faculty members who have joint appointments. There may be some affiliate faculty, but there's not necessarily a lot of conversation that happens among faculty themselves, on an intellectual or pedagogical level. And so students I think the students are faced with, well, if I want to find a black professor, or I want to get a class on racialized blackness and black folks, I've got to go to African American studies, but I don't want to go to African American studies because they're all nationalists over there or whatever, right? Or I don't want to take a class in English on literature of the African diaspora, as a person of color, because I'm going to be I'm the only one, right? So I'm just going to put that away, right? So I think there's I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think the structures, the divisions between departments, and the sense of kind of often competing for resources or for students, makes it difficult for students to kind of explore more. And I think that for me that was the kind of excitement about being in a liberal arts college, that you really could just take a lot of different things. Wesleyan only had like maybe 5 or 6 requirements, whereas Berkeley has, I think we just reduced it to like 9 or 10, like maybe 10, right? And if you're a transfer student and you've only got like 2 years
to take those 10 courses,
what else, so there's like not a lot you can take. And I think there's like, so I'm sorry, I don't feel like I'm being super articulate about it, but I think so I think numbers, I think a kind of more openness intellectually, more collaboration would create space for students.
What are the obstacles to that at Berkeley?
Well, this is the part where I'm probably going to get this wrong, but so let's say you're teaching a large lecture course on race and film, and you want to cross-list it with film studies. Well, the question becomes, who pays for the teaching assistants? Which department is going to pay the faculty member out of their teaching budget? How do who gets credit for the large number? Mm-hmm. And so that has so I've never actually been able to cross list a course. I do a lot, and I think this is actually part of like me coming from private schools, is that I'm like, there's always a way to ask somebody to do something to make it work out. And so I do something called room sharing. So you basically are teaching the same class. You're teaching 2 different classes in 2 different departments, but in the same room at the same time, right? And that sort of works, but it doesn't say like cross-listed, right? And it doesn't have that same kind of, I don't think it carries that same kind of weight.
Well, and it's harder to do on any kind of scale, I imagine. Like, you're not going to get hundreds of faculty members doing that.
No, you don't. One of the ways that the American Studies program is so unique and successful is that they don't have a lot of their own faculty. What they're able to do is buy out other faculties teaching from other departments for a semester. So they buy out courses. That's how they use their budget. And so they're able to get faculty in English or architecture or wherever to teach courses under the American Studies banner. But then also, I don't know. I mean, I think for students, it's like the hard. Well, I think also just like a clearer policy around what counts as, discrimination on campus. And, it was on a panel recently, and where one of the other panelists was arguing, I think the phrase was, ideas aren't teddy bears, right? And that free speech, that you don't go to a class to get comforted, right? And you should be willing to accept and to be challenged and to hear things that you're not going to want to hear, right? And the whole time that she was talking, and it's like, we teach very different populations, right? Because my students, they want really difficult. They know that the history of race in the United States, for example, is not a pretty history. They're not trying to be dissuaded from that, but they also want a space to be angry, right? Or a space to be hurt, and then to sort of be able to have the language to say to students in other classrooms, no, that's not okay what you're saying, right? That's actually that's what you just said was quite racist, and we need to address that, right? So I think just having a different kind of a stated policy, that is actively in support of actively demonstrates a commitment to diversity, which is very hard, obviously, right?
Well, but what's interesting to me about what you're saying is it's obvious it's harder in a place where the disciplines are so siloed that there isn't even a sense of a kind of general endeavor. It's all kind of its own. You're involved in like these subsets. So getting a kind of philosophical principle to carry across the curriculum is going to be harder to do in that setting.
I think also that part of it for me too is I just think it's such a big campus. There are 1,500 faculty members on UC Berkeley campus. So it's sort of, even just figuring out who's who and what they're doing and how to make those connections. Sometimes it's just like, it's like serendipity. You're like, oh, I just ran into you at a talk and you're somebody whose work I read. I didn't even know you were here on this campus, right? But trying to, so I think, I think graduate students, I really encourage graduate students to do this kind of work, to reach out to other faculty, to create working groups with other graduate students. I think that's really important. And this was, I think, also I should say that one of this sense of belonging that I had at Yale came from the fact that African American studies and American studies were so closely tied, and I always felt welcome in American studies classes, which was not the case of people who were in other joint programs, right? I had a friend in history who every year had to get the department secretary to put his name back on the mailbox, right? Like his name just got pulled off the mailbox. Like they just never gave him a mailbox. So to have to, that kind of microaggression, to have to, just like, no, I'm still here. Can you put my name back on the mailbox? Is I think challenging. So I think there are also just a lot of ways that, large scale ways, but I think a lot of small ways that, the university, the university sends these kind of signals that students aren't welcome. I think also in terms of numbers, a lot of students who come, black students who come, students of color, aren't as well prepared. So they may be, the top person in their very underfunded school, and maybe they were able to take one AP course or two AP courses, but they're competing with kids from, Mill Valley or wherever who, been taking AP classes since they were in 10th grade, right?
They already have a college education.
They already have a college education, exactly. So, they know how to write. They know how to speak in class. They know how to, so all of the kinds of, like, sort of disciplinary, both disciplinary and performative elements, but the kind of just the basic skills. I think the other thing I would say, there's a report that just came out at Berkeley, a task force on the state of athletics at the university, and this has been a huge issue in terms of just how the students. So there are about 900 Black undergraduates on Cal campus. A third of those are athletes. Those athletes are often dissuaded from participating in any kind of political or group activities. So the kind of the way in which their athletic, their participation in sports, which is basically often paying their tuition, precludes them from being part of a larger community. I've had student athletes tell me this over and over and over again. So when there was a student protest a few years ago, in which Black students stood in front of Southern Gate, sort of one of the main sites on campus, and it was a silent protest. None of the Black athletes participated, and many of the students were like, well, they never come out, and blah blah blah, and they don't think they're part of this or anything, and the athletes are saying, we're afraid we're going to lose our eligibility. So there's that. There's just the kind of the kind of affirmative action that comes with bringing in revenue generating athletes, students who just I've had at least one or two students that I'm like, I don't know that, they don't read very well, right? And so that's also like yet another message, right? That we like you to be here if you can, you can throw a ball, right? You can make a basket, and you can sell T-shirts, or I guess as the case may be now, there's a big battle because the university has signed a 3-year promotional deal with Coors.
The beer company.
Yes. I'm like, you're a college. You're a college. 75% of your undergraduate population can't actually drink. We have a major problem with drinking and sexual violence, right? In the fraternity houses, but you're going to enter into a financial, into an advertising agreement with Coors Brewery. So, so I guess the other thing that could happen on a big scale is a reinvestment in higher education on the state level. Right,
which is where I wanted to go next, actually.
Yeah.
So, because you've been at Berkeley for some really interesting years. Yeah. Interesting in the sense of that old Chinese curse, maybe live in interesting times. So you arrived in Berkeley in about 2006?
2004.
Four, okay. Mm-hmm. So you've been there 10 years, through 10 really turbulent years, and especially the last 6.
Yes.
So do you want to just talk about first of all, so you were hired at the junior level in African American Studies, and that's been your only appointment.
That's been my only appointment.
And now you have chaired that department.
Well, I was chair for a summer. I was chair for a month, and it was the worst month ever. So I'm never going to do that again.
Okay.
Sorry.
So,
anyway.
So you live and learn. That's good. But you have been in the same department, and now you are senior faculty,
right.
And you have lived through the crash and the various responses to the crash. So can you just kind of narrate us through those years in the UC system?
Oh gosh. Okay. So I always get my dates confused. Partly because there's a point where, because Occupy was kind of emerged on UC campus in many ways, or had it sort of, before Occupy. Those years just start to blend in together. Let's see, I want to say it was fall 2008, 2009, after the financial meltdown. It basically, UC, the state of California was in crisis. it withdrew a huge amount of funding from the UC system, and the first of several tuition hikes went into place, which increased the tuition by 32%. And so at that point, I want to say, the tuition at some point was like around $8,000, and right now it's $12,000 a year, right? So this is over the course of 4 or 5 years, which is just a huge increase, right? And then granted, we're obviously still far cheaper than than most private schools. But, once you add in everything else, if you're out of state, the tuition is actually higher. It's actually higher to go to UC Berkeley than it is to go to Stanford, right? As an out-of-state student. Anyway, so in the course of this, the downturn, tuition rose, hiring was frozen. Many staff had not gotten merit increases or just cost of living increases for a very long time. Faculty and staff were furloughed for a year, so everybody took an 8% pay cut across the board, and students decided this was bullshit, and they launched a series of protests, including in November of 2009, an occupation of Wheeler Hall, which is one of the largest campus buildings one of the largest classroom buildings on campus. So things started to heat up, and then, sort of as the cycle of the school year goes, so goes the cycle of protest, right? So by May, things had quieted down. It seemed like in the fall of 2010, when did Occupy start? 2011?
11.
Yeah, so 2010 felt kind of like a quiet year that people were trying to figure out, okay, how do we address these issues? Oh, right, because of course 2010 was the year that Fred Weissman came to campus and filmed at Berkeley, right? So it was, and I think that film actually is a kind of accurate depiction of the ways in which different constituencies were trying to figure out how do we deal with the funding crisis with tuitions. There's a whole scene that's just devoted to the administrators trying to figure out how do we deal with protest on campus, right? Who do we talk to, and when do we call the cops in? And that was the other thing that we saw too, was with these protests was the increased militarization of UC police, campus police, and calling on Alameda County Sheriff's Office. And,
right. So the famous moment was at Davis.
The famous moment,
but this was going up and down the UC system.
Up and down the UC system, there was a incident where a UCPD pulled a gun on some student protesters at UCLA, at Berkeley. During the Wheeler Hall occupation, I was watching. You see students getting beaten with, or just jabbed with clubs. I had students coming into my classroom who were just showing me their bruises, and that just got, obviously then in 2011 when students and faculty tried to set up an Occupy encampment on Sproul Plaza. We also saw that footage as well, where the UCPD or the police grabbed a faculty member by her hair and pulled her. So that was also, my office building is right across the small lane from Sproul Hall, which is a main administrative building. But it's also where UCPD is housed. So, it was often that space between my office building and Sproul was often the staging ground for the police in these actions. And it was just, I always just thought that this was not why. I was like, how did I get here, right? How did this happen? This was not where I was supposed to be. So then Occupy kind of reignited a number of ignited the protest. It gave a broader movement, a kind of broader context for the campus activities, since so much of what people had been protesting in 2009 around the increased corporatization of the university, that there were like more administrators than there were faculty members, the rise in that students at an institution that is largely or is meant to kind of serve the public are being asked to take on the financial burden, right, of their education because Chevron won't pay its taxes, right? So there's so that was already, and the whole Bay Area also ended up being just an incredible site for Occupy. So there haven't been, since 2011, there haven't been as many protests, I think, in part because the tuition has stabilized. There hasn't been another increase, although I think it may be in the works. The state of California has reinstated some of the funding.
That's one of the things I wanted to ask about, because from the outside it looks like the state is in much, much better shape than it was 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah. But how much of that has made its way back to the UC system? And
I will say it's a little hard for me to because I'm at the flagship school, right? So so we always fare better, right, than say UC Riverside, or certainly than the Cal States and the community colleges. I think the community colleges are really struggling. They continue to struggle. There have been layoffs. They're shrinking classrooms or class offerings. So I think some of it has filtered down. We've seen it in departments of the hiring freeze has been lifted. So there've been a lot of new faculty hired. Also, in part, they've been the university's been trying to offer packages to as incentive to get more senior faculty to retire, to create some space. But they've done so they've found, so some of it, like we're seeing it kind of stabilized, but some of the ways that that's showing up are, there's a new two-tiered pension system, right? So the kind of buy-in that all faculty had to pay has now been changed to a kind of sliding scale based on your age and your number of years in service to the university. They have increased the number of out-of-state and international students. So one of the things we've also seen is just an increase in foreign nationals, particularly in summer school, where we actually had to ask the summer sessions to institute a TOEFL requirement, because they were just kind of like coming in. And I would teach these summer classes, and we'd say, for a couple of years, I was saying, I'm getting through the material so quickly. Like, I was adding all this stuff to I was like, oh, I have so much time and so much. And I realized it was because, a quarter of the class really didn't speak any English. So when I stopped and said, any questions? Nobody had questions. Nobody knew what the hell I was talking about. So I think these are, so some of the ways that they're
paying full ride.
They're paying full ride, right? Also, what we're seeing now, and then the kind of continued partnering around, so one of the big concerns in 2009 and 2011 was around the privatization of student debt, what we're also now seeing are the rise of kind of private dorms, right? So like there are all these kind of weird apartment buildings that are springing up around campus that are meant to kind of approximate dorm living, but we actually have a new vice chancellor of real estate at the university. Yeah, everybody's like, what is that? I mean, I'm sure like maybe a place like Columbia has one, right, already, but
or at least NYU.
Or at least NYU, exactly. So there are ways, I think, in which sort of the regents, the UC regents, and the structure, the way they're kind of alleviating some of the financial pressure are in ways that I think are fundamentally changing the California master plan, the kind of the sense that this is that the UCs and the Cal States and the community colleges serve a public function for the citizens of the state of California. And so I think it's, and there's part of me that wants to be pragmatic about all of this and say, okay, well, this can't be, there is no alternative. But my training in graduate school often taught me, right, that there always has to be an alternative, and always question when people say that, right, and to find other ways. And so, one of the things, there are a few people who've put together, a number of plans, like, what would it take for the UCs to be free again, right? And it's something like, if every citizen in the state paid, $100 more a year in taxes or something crazy like that, we would be able to fund public education. So, on a mass scale. So I think there's some stability, but I don't think, and I think also part of that stability, to be honest, again, is the nature of student protests on a campus, right? So, the people who were active in 2009 are, almost to a person, they're long gone, right? Some of those folks actually went and, moved to New York and became involved in Occupy, right? But I think, sometimes I think part of my work in the classroom is not just providing kind of, historical context to the present kind of, racial crisis, but a kind of institutional
of which there always is one.
Which always there is one, exactly. But to, just say, what is the, what kind of institutional memory, right, do you need to have to understand, why you're paying the tuition you're paying, or why your classrooms look the way they do. I mean, I will say things are better. Like, even just one of the points of contention is that the infrastructure was things were literally falling apart on campus. There was an instructor, a chalkboard fell on her. I shouldn't laugh because that's not really funny, but it just sort of became emblematic. The thing we're seeing now, there's a lot of construction happening. So everything feels really good right now. But I think I think that there's another tuition hike is going to come. The situation around student debt has not stabilized in any way.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. We'll see.
There were also, now it was a few years ago, and it might have been pre-crash, I'm not certain,
Mm-hmm.
but there was a kind of frank discussion on the part of the regent or the state to make Berkeley like not just a state university, but like a global university. And
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, you're talking about the influx of international students. That certainly
Mm-hmm.
would be one part of it. But one of the questions I have, especially from where you sit in the African American Studies Department, is what is the fate of older paradigms like, good old-fashioned diversity and multiculturalism in these settings where the priorities have seemingly shifted so drastically?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question, and it's one that I'm not going to be able to offer a really definitive or strong answer on. I think in part because I think I don't know that those terms. On one hand, I think they've been abandoned, in the sense that nobody uses. Multiculturalism is a kind of nostalgic term, right? That came from an earlier period. It's something alumni talk about, right? I think diversity is still bandied about, but I don't know. I think one of the challenges. One way I think I see maybe it working is that there are ways in which the UCs are incredibly diverse, and they're more diverse than any private liberal arts school, in that, because students can come in through community college, they can transfer in via community college, because you can, we get a lot of students who are returning after long hiatuses, a number of students who are formerly incarcerated, student parents. There's a very strong student parent support program that actually provides some funding and housing. That there's a strong program for veterans. So there are a number of Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans who come in, who are students, and many students, because it's not necessarily a $50,000 price tag. People are trying to come up with their $12,000, which is still a lot, but it's people end up working, right? So there is a kind of class diversity and often life diversity, I think, among the student body, certainly at UC Berkeley, that is not, I certainly didn't see in the other institutions that I had been in. Everybody was kind of, 18, right? Everybody was 18. You never saw a kid. You never saw anybody who was, who was under 15 or who was older than 60 unless they were like in front of your classroom, right? Like at the front of your classroom. So I think the problem, though, is that sometimes that diversity, that model of diversity, which is important, sometimes I think comes to stand in for a kind of, the kind of racial justice and equity that those sort of older models of
right. The public university is in fact serving the public.
Right. So we can have all of these different kinds of students, but the student body is only 3% Black in a state that is, I want to say, like 10% Black African American. That is, it's 7% Latino in a state that's like 30%, right? So there are ways in which that diversity, it masks the very real failings of a kind of older project of diversity, multiculturalism, affirmative action. And I think part of that problem. So I think, and this is also where I think not pedagogy, but intellectually this becomes an issue because, on the level of faculty, it's so incredibly, the numbers of non-white faculty are so small. And I mean, there are 18 Black women faculty on the UC Berkeley campus. 12 of them are, I think, at the associate level. And 6 of them are in my department. right? So, but I think, that sense also that, diversity can happen over there. So, okay, so then I think the other thing that then happens is that people get lauded for doing diversity work, but the definition of diversity becomes very diffuse. And so, people can, so diversity can look like, oh, I'm serving underrepresented students. Well, that may be, like in my department, we can actually write, we can put a white man up for a diversity fellowship in our department because that's diversity within African American studies, right? So I think that, there are these ways, and I guess in The Wire, you can juke the numbers, right? So I don't know if that really. So it's and I just say that because it's something that I'm actively trying to understand myself. Is what's the purchase of these terms and what do we mean? But there is also the other part of it is the kind of just the broader branding of Berkeley, of the Berkeley name as, on one hand, right, the place that has all of these Nobel laureates and and is the home of the atomic bomb or whatever, but is also this site of long protest, right? And so the kind of branding that enables the university to trade in on that. They did just create this global campus, but it's interesting because it's in Richmond, which is a pretty, just 2 towns away, and it's pretty impoverished. So I think it's kind of an interesting model. It's not.
What does global campus mean?
I am not even sure. I think it just means. Honestly, I'm not even clear. Like I've read some of the publicity material, and I think actually they're kind of aiming for kind of open university more. It's not in Abu Dhabi, so that's kind of a good thing. But I'm not sure what it actually means. There's a lot of stuff that's happening right now, a lot of initiatives that I'm not really sure.
Well, so that's one of my questions too about. The current state of the UC system. How much sense do you have that educators are actually in the room for all of these discussions and these initiatives and the decision making and
Yeah, no, not a whole lot. I think there are a few. I think it depends on which level. The regents mostly aren't educators. Our new vice provost of real estate, I'm like, did you even teach a course on real estate? No. And I think it's not just that, educators themselves are absent from or represented. They're it's like they use the quote, right? They get all the stakeholders wrong, right? Like, so even in, so for example, there's an initiative. So they'll put together a panel, or a task force that's sort of meant to kind of, investigate the sort of status of undergraduate education in letters and science. But they're like, there's only one person from the humanities, right? So I think it gets replicated, on a number of different levels. I think I spent a year on one of these sort of faculty and these dean's task forces, and it was really fascinating because I got the sense that part of what was driving this was not necessarily just this kind of commitment to improving undergraduate education, but that there were funders who had come in and said, we would like to spend money, right? We'd like to invest money. So give us all your best ideas, which was kind of, it's exciting, but it also just felt, it felt kind of, it felt like it originated from the wrong place, a little bit, and that was a year where I learned a lot of corporate speak, and that, I think that also really scared me, was the kind of the language, that, so, I mean, even though there were a lot of educators in the room, all of the deans knew, they knew how to speak to the funders in the room. So I learned, that, we need to think about the low-hanging fruit, and we, need to take into consideration who the various stakeholders are, and how do we, it was just, I think I purposely try to lose some of that language, but so part of it, I'm not getting a sense that there are a lot of educators in these conversations. Certainly, our new, the new president of the UC is not. She's, not an educator. I will say, though, I think that there are, the new chancellor and the new executive vice provost are people who are both actively committed to, to diversity, who do work around race in as part of their own scholarship. So I think there are some kinds of concerns, but I think they both come from private institutions, and I think things just work a little differently. I think part of also what you're probably hearing in my voice is that Berkeley is a place that prides itself on faculty governance, that faculty sit on a lot of committees and oversee a number of things, but we don't have a union. We don't have a formal union. But I've just been, and I spent a little bit of time trying to kind of feel out that world once I got tenure. And I don't know, there's part of me that thinks I'd be really good at it. I could do that really well, and I could be a change maker. But it also scares me a little bit because I think what happens is that, I remember Jon Stewart interviewing then Senator Obama and saying, "It seems to me that the Senate is a place where good people go to die." And I feel like, California Hall, which is where the president's dean's office are, it's where good people go to die. It's like, you're so, you're not actually in a classroom. You're not necessarily in those conversations and figuring out, and the students, the sort of relationship to the students are as consumers, right? Either as consumers or as antagonists. So there's not necessarily that same kind of partnership. And so I guess I'm at a point right now where maybe what it is I'm trying to get my work done until the next protest comes.
There you go.
So.
It's that cycle. So one more question.
Sure.
I mean, one of the things, looking from the outside at the UC system, one is struck by the seeming kind of balkanization between, well, you mentioned before, kind of flagship and branch,
Sure.
But then there's also the UC versus
Right.
the Cal State.
Right.
Have there been efforts to really have meaningful conversations across these different institutions? How much possibility is there to make kind of meaningful alliances across the UC system?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have all the information on that. I think, I guess it hadn't actually occurred to me that divide until the sort of the first round of budget cuts, and faculty and administrators at UC San Diego tried to send a letter. They wrote a letter to the UC regents where they were trying to basically split the 10 UCs into a two-tiered system, and saying, okay, so the three top schools are Berkeley, LA, and San Diego, right? And then everybody else.
Conveniently.
Conveniently.
We're on that
right.
list.
And of course you have like San Diego. Anyway, but so I think, so I didn't really even recognize how the kind of divides within that. I think there are a few UC-wide efforts to try and do these, to either reach out across programs. So, for example, there's a recent effort to kind of coordinate Black Studies programs across the UC system. The UC Humanities Research Initiative created a task force and working group on changing conditions of labor in the academy, and there's a panel here at the ASA that they're doing. So I think they're trying to kind of both to do work to sort of have make some interventions on both an intellectual and scholarly level and on a kind of policy level. I don't, but in terms of kind of across the three tiers, I don't know how much of that is happening. Again, though, I think so much of that work often happens amongst the students, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's the students who, are students who go through, the community college system and then transfer to a CSU or to a UC, right? That was part of the promise of the master plan, right? That if you could get the right grades and fulfill the requirements, you were guaranteed access. So I think, I hope that there's some conversations between, and I think there are between the folks who are working at least with students at the community college level and at the CSUs and USCs. But, I guess also there was, during the protests, a few groups that, Bob Meister's, what's the name of his? This is where I apologize because I fail you on this. Robert Meister, who's at UC Santa Cruz, organized a number of faculty across different institutions to talk about a number of these issues. And then, oh my God. I'm so sorry. Sorry, I shouldn't say that on your tape. The You to the Rescue blog, Chris Newfield and Bob Morantz.
I'm interviewing Chris tomorrow.
Okay, great. Chris's plan, there's a lot to debate around his plan, but he has come up with a number of really interesting, it's this is how we can make this work. So I think there are these pockets, but I have to say I don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't know, on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate the time you've taken. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that we should have?
No, I guess I just would want to say that, even though all of my training has been very, come from very elite institutions. I am really proud to be part of, to be a public school teacher, really. And I think, I think in many ways, we are not just the UCs, not just UC Berkeley, not just the UCs, but public schools really are ground zero of this battle. I think we need to be part of any sort of conversation about the corporate university or what have you. I think, this is when I feel sort of unsure about what my mission is, and if I'm being too, I'm caught in the ivory tower, and I have no, really, what is this work worth? I am reminded when I go to my public school campus and I enter my classroom that this is where I'm supposed to be, or at least this is the fight that I should be having. So I'm glad you're doing this project.
Yeah. Well, on my very best days, I just think, surely this society won't give up on education as we've known it. What do you think? Because on my worst days, it's a question I have.
Yeah, it's hard because I think, we are watching that, right? It's actively happening. People actively giving up. Reading comments and blogs, and sort of the kind of persistent anti-intellectualism, the disinvestment from of these structures. I think also the sense. I'm sure you're going to talk to somebody about online education, but I think the rush, the push for that is so dangerous. The way it's being presented to us as this kind of panacea for all of our ills, and it feels. I think what's hard is that it sometimes feels for me. It just feels really hard to make the case of why. What is the value of your degree? And I think part of the problem is that that question is framed as a question of one of value, and the only way we know how to talk about value really is around capital. And so if we, so I think part of the challenge then is how do we reframe the debate, and what are and again, right? we've used all these words, investment and value, but how do we understand it as a greater good? I think actually maybe the place where I do have hope is in the interdisciplines, and in those places, in the sort of the non-traditional students. I think that's actually, those first-generation college students, all of the folks who understand education as a route to social mobility, to economic mobility. I think those are the, well, not all of those folks, but I think some of those folks, who gain a better sense of self and sit up straighter, right, for having read Du Bois, right? I think that's when I feel like, okay, this is when people can't let this go. This feeling's too good, right? And that sense of self. But damn if I know. I'm just, I don't know. That's not a good way to end an interview. So I would say the struggle continues. How about that? Is that good? Okay.
Thank you very much, Leigh Raiford.